I remember the pen more than anything else. It was blue, slightly scratched near the clip, the kind my mother kept in her purse for church sign-in sheets and bank forms. She held it carefully as if the paper in front of her required neat handwriting and steady nerves. I was sitting beside her in a quiet hospital office, convinced this was a misunderstanding that would be cleared up in an hour. "They just need to evaluate you," she said without looking at me. "It's temporary." Temporary. I had repeated that word in my head like a promise. Across the desk, a clinician explained procedures in soft, neutral language. Observation period. Stabilization. Safety concerns. I kept waiting for someone to ask me what actually happened. No one did. My brother stood near the window, arms crossed, jaw tight. He didn't look at me either. When my mother signed the final page, she exhaled like someone finishing an unpleasant but necessary chore. I remember thinking she must know something I didn't, that there had been a mistake and this was the quickest way to fix it. "I'll visit tomorrow," she said, finally meeting my eyes. "We'll sort it out." The door behind me clicked shut with a sound that felt small at the time. Ordinary. Administrative. I didn't realize then that I wouldn't walk back through it for 2 years. I didn't realize then how carefully that decision had been planned. Before that office, before the locked door and the paperwork, I was predictable in the best way. I woke up early. I kept lists. I color-coded my calendar and rarely missed deadlines. In high school, teachers described me as focused. In college, professors called me disciplined. I had earned a partial scholarship to study public policy, not because anyone pushed me toward it, but because I liked understanding systems, how decisions were made, how rules were written, how small clauses could change outcomes. I planned to go to law school. I had already taken the LSAT once, scored well enough to feel confident about improving it. My laptop was filled with drafts of personal statements and internship applications. I had secured a summer position with a local advocacy group, the kind of work that doesn't make headlines but changes paperwork quietly. I was not impulsive. I did not scream in arguments. I did not throw things. I did not disappear for nights without explanation. My brother Daniel did all of that. He was magnetic when he wanted to be. Friends gravitated toward him. He could walk into a room and make it feel like a party. But he was also reckless in ways that were always explained away. Missed classes were creative distractions. Parking tickets were bad luck. A fistfight in college became a misunderstanding. When bills arrived with late fees, my mother sighed and paid them. When professors sent warning emails, she called and negotiated extensions. Daniel's volatility was reframed as passion. His mistakes were reframed as growing pains. I was the calm one, the one who drove him home when he'd had too much to drink, the one who rewrote his resumes after he quit another job, the one who stood between him and my father when tempers flared. That should have been my first clue. Responsibility makes you useful. Usefulness makes you expendable when narratives need adjusting. The night everything shifted, I had come home from the library. My backpack was heavy with case notes and highlighted articles. I remember placing it on the kitchen chair and asking my mother if she needed help with dinner. An hour later, the police were in our living room. I won't describe every detail of that night yet. Not because I can't, but because context matters. What I will say is this: I was sober. I was coherent. I was trying to de-escalate. And somehow by the time statements were written, I was the unstable one. When the clinician asked whether I'd been sleeping well, I answered honestly. 4 or 5 hours, I said. It's exam season. She wrote something down. When she asked whether I felt stressed, I nodded. Of course. I have finals. Another note. I thought being transparent was proof of stability. I was wrong. By the time my mother signed those papers, the version of me being discussed in that office no longer resembled the person I had been building for years. But I knew who I was. Organized. Ambitious. Calm under pressure. What I didn't understand was how easily that could be rewritten. In our house, Daniel was the storm and I was expected to be the umbrella. That was the unspoken arrangement. When he forgot assignments, I was asked why I hadn't reminded him. When he crashed the car at 17, my father yelled about responsibility while looking at me, not him. I was the older sister by 18 months, which in my mother's logic meant I was the stabilizing force. You're the sensible one, she would say, as if that were a compliment. Sensible meant adaptable. It meant absorbing disappointment without reacting. It meant understanding that Daniel needed more guidance. When he broke curfew, I was told to check on him next time. When he failed a semester, my mother said I should help him study. When he punched a hole in his bedroom wall during an argument, she insisted he was overwhelmed and that I should be more patient. I remember once in middle school he stole money from my desk drawer. Not much. $20 I had saved from tutoring a neighbor's son. When I confronted him, he laughed it off. My mother's response wasn't anger at him. It was a lecture to me about provoking him. "You know how sensitive he is," she said. "You don't need to escalate." Escalate. The word followed me for years. Any attempt to defend myself became escalation. Any refusal to accommodate became selfishness. Family loyalty was the phrase that sealed everything. "We protect our own," my father would say, especially when Daniel's mistakes began to attract outside attention. A suspended license. A dismissed charge. A string of debts quietly settled before collectors could call too loudly. Protecting our own meant protecting him. It also meant sacrificing me in small, unnoticeable ways. If a teacher called about a classroom incident, I was expected to vouch for his stress. If a neighbor complained about noise, I apologized on his behalf. I learned early that smoothing things over kept the peace. Peace in our house was the absence of visible conflict. It was not the presence of fairness. There's a particular kind of neglect that doesn't look like neglect from the outside. There were family dinners. There were birthday cakes. There were photographs of smiling faces in coordinated outfits. But attention was uneven. When Daniel got accepted into a mediocre business program, after years of drifting my parents through a celebratory barbecue. When I received a scholarship letter, my mother folded it neatly and said, "That's helpful." Helpful. Not proud. Not extraordinary. Helpful. I didn't resent him. Not in the way people expect. I didn't wake up plotting against him or tallying his advantages. I told myself he needed more support. That I was strong enough to carry my own weight. What I wanted quietly was acknowledgement. Just once I wanted someone to say, "You don't have to manage this." But the pattern was too established. If Daniel was late for dinner, we waited. If I was late, I was inconsiderate. If he raised his voice, it was passion. If I did, it was instability. Instability. Looking back, I see how the groundwork was laid long before that office and that blue pen. A narrative had been rehearsed for years. I was the reasonable one until reason became inconvenient. Then I was rigid, cold, overwhelmed. I remember thinking in college that adulthood would rebalance things. That once we were both responsible for ourselves, the comparisons would fade. I was wrong. When Daniel's mistakes grew heavier, the stakes grew higher. Protecting him required more elaborate explanations, more strategic framing. And I was still the sensible one. Still the one expected to understand. Back then I thought loyalty meant endurance. That loving your family meant absorbing more than your share. Now, with the distance of years and locked doors between then and here, I see it differently. Loyalty without boundaries isn't devotion. It's erasure. The golden sun was always worth saving. The convenient daughter was easier to rewrite. The night everything unraveled began with a phone call. Daniel had been at a bar downtown. I didn't know that until my mother answered her phone at 11:47 p.m., and her expression drained of color. She didn't say much, just "We're coming," before hanging up. He had been drinking. He had borrowed a friend's car. He had decided he was fine to drive. He wasn't. By the time we reached the scene, the car was angled halfway onto a curb, headlights shattered, one wheel bent unnaturally. No one had been killed. That detail mattered later. But someone had been injured, another driver shaken and bleeding, sitting on the back of an ambulance. Daniel stood off to the side, swaying slightly, his shirt torn at the collar. He looked less afraid than annoyed. When the officer asked what happened, Daniel started talking fast. Too fast. "She grabbed the wheel," he said, suddenly gesturing toward me. "We were arguing." I remember staring at him, confused. I hadn't been in the car. I had been at home studying until my mother received the call. "What?" I said, stepping forward. The officer's gaze shifted to me. "Were you in the vehicle?" "No," I said immediately. "I wasn't there." Daniel shook his head as if disappointed in my denial. "She's been stressed," he added. "She gets worked up." That should have been my first warning. My mother moved quickly, then positioning herself between Daniel and the officer. "My daughter has been under a lot of pressure," she said carefully. She hasn't been sleeping. She's been emotional. Emotional. I wasn't even there, I repeated. The officer's pen paused midair. Ma'am, are you saying your daughter was in the vehicle or not? My mother hesitated. It was brief. Almost imperceptible. She came to pick him up earlier, she said. They argued. Argued. The truth was simple. I had refused to pick him up. I had an exam the next morning. But in that moment clarity was replaced by suggestion. Daniel leaned into it. She gets intense, he said. You know how she is. No one had ever described me that way before. Or maybe they had in smaller contexts and I hadn't recognized it. By the time statements were written, the narrative had shifted. I was the stressed sister. The one who overreacted. The one who escalated. Daniel's blood alcohol level was high. That couldn't be erased. But motive could be blurred. Responsibility could be redistributed. The following morning, when a social worker contacted our home citing concerns about a domestic altercation tied to reckless behavior, my mother was ready. She's not herself lately, she said, lowering her voice. We're worried. Worried. She listed my late-night study sessions as insomnia, my intensity as volatility, my insistence on facts as agitation. Each detail, harmless alone, became evidence when framed carefully. I tried to explain. I tried to untangle it. But once instability is suggested, everything you say can be interpreted as proof. By the time we sat in that quiet hospital office, the story had hardened. Daniel had made a mistake, I had become the risk. The first night felt unreal. Not terrifying. Not dramatic. Just disorienting in a way that made everything slightly unreal, like the edges of the world had been sanded down. The room was small. Neutral walls. A narrow bed bolted to the floor. A window that didn't open. I kept waiting for someone to say there had been a mistake. Instead, a nurse handed me a clipboard and asked me to sign intake forms. Observation period. 72 hours, they said at first. I remember counting those hours carefully. 72 turned into an extended evaluation. The evaluation turned into a recommendation. The recommendation turned into a court-approved commitment based on family testimony and presenting behavior. Presenting behavior. I learned quickly that calmness can be misread as flat effect. That insistence on logic can be interpreted as rigidity. That asking too many questions can be seen as defiance. The building ran on routines. Breakfast at 7. Medication rounds at 8. Group sessions mid-morning. Silence after 10 at night. At first I tried to explain myself to anyone who would listen. I recounted timelines. I corrected statements. I pointed out inconsistencies in the paperwork. One clinician tilted her head sympathetically and said, "It's common for patients to externalize responsibility." Externalize. I stopped explaining after that. Instead, I started documenting. Every conversation. Every date. Every change in diagnosis language. I wrote in the margins of old notebooks and on the backs of program schedules. When I ran out of paper, I memorized patterns. Who asked what? Who wrote what down? Who avoided eye contact when I mentioned my brother? 2 weeks in, my mother visited. She sat across from me in a room with a camera mounted in the corner. Her purse rested on her lap like it always had. "This is for your own good," she said. "For how long?" I asked. "As long as it takes," she replied, not unkindly. That phrase echoed for months. Daniel didn't visit. I heard about him indirectly. A nurse mentioning he had called once. A staff member referencing a family situation that required discretion. I learned that information moves differently inside institutions. Facts become summaries. Summaries become diagnoses. At my first review, hearing my mother testified that I had become increasingly erratic. That I isolated myself. That I reacted intensely to minor stressors. There was truth woven into those statements. I had been studying late. I had been frustrated. I had been tired. But truth selectively arranged becomes something else. The panel extended my stay. That was the moment I understood this wasn't about stabilization. It was about containment. Time inside doesn't move evenly. Some days collapse into each other. Others stretch painfully long. I began to observe the system the way I once studied policy frameworks. Who had authority? Who influenced decisions? How family narratives shaped clinical interpretations. I noticed how often women labeled high-functioning were described as controlling when they asserted boundaries. How emotional restraint was sometimes recoded as detachment. I wasn't the only one there who insisted she didn't belong. But I was the only one who had been delivered by her own parent. Loneliness inside an institution is different from ordinary loneliness. It's not just physical separation. It's narrative isolation. You begin to question your own memory, because everyone around you is referencing a version of events you don't recognize. There were nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the accident scene in my mind, replaying Daniel's words, my mother's hesitation, the officer's pen. I remember thinking over and over that if I could just find the right sentence, the right phrasing, I could unlock it. I was wrong. No single sentence dismantles a coordinated narrative. Strength, I learned, isn't loud. It's consistent. I started attending group sessions without arguing, answering questions without over-explaining, meeting criteria without trying to win. Compliance, I realized, moves faster than resistance in controlled systems. 6 months in, a new caseworker was assigned to my file. She read through my records slowly, occasionally frowning. "You've had no behavioral incidents," she said during our first one-on-one meeting. "No," I replied. "No medication refusal. No aggression. No rule violations." "No." She nodded once thoughtfully. I didn't realize then how important that detail would become. Time passed. Seasons shifted outside the sealed windows. I marked birthdays quietly. My scholarship offer expired. My law school plans dissolved into something abstract. But something else formed in their place. Clarity. Inside, stripped of comparison and expectation, I began to see my family dynamic without emotion clouding it. I mapped it the way I once mapped policy loopholes. Daniel's recklessness required protection. My stability made me plausible as a scapegoat. The institution wasn't the origin of my confinement. It was the instrument. By the end of the second year, I was no longer waiting to be rescued. I was waiting for an opening. And openings, I had learned, appear when narratives become inconsistent. I just had to be ready. The opening came disguised as routine paperwork. My new caseworker, Ms. Alvarez, requested a full file audit before my annual review. She was methodical in a way that felt different from the others, less interested in narrative, more interested in documentation. "I want to cross-reference initial statements," she said one afternoon, sliding a thin folder across the table toward me. "Sometimes details get summarized." Summarized. I recognized the word immediately. She flipped to the original police report from the night of the accident. I had never seen the unedited version before, only the clinical interpretations that followed. "There's something here," she said quietly. Daniel's blood alcohol level was clearly documented. The timeline showed that I had not been present at the scene when officers first arrived. A neighbor had called my mother after seeing the crash, not Daniel. The report also noted that Daniel initially claimed he had been alone. Alone. My breath slowed as I read it again. "He changed his statement later," Ms. Alvarez added. "After speaking privately with a family member." Family member. The phrase sat heavily between us. Further down in the intake notes, I saw my mother's statement typed neatly beneath a heading labeled Collateral Information. It described me as volatile under stress, fixated on controlling outcomes, increasingly detached from reality. But there was no documentation of any prior incidents. No medical history supporting instability. No school records indicating behavioral problems. Just her testimony. "Did you ever receive a copy of this?" Ms. Alvarez asked. "No," I said. She nodded slowly. "It appears the recommendation for extended commitment relied heavily on family input." I swallowed. "And on the revised accident narrative." She met my eyes. "Yes." I traced the sequence carefully. Daniel crashes. He is intoxicated. He initially admits being alone. After speaking with my mother, his account shifts. I become part of the argument. My stress becomes a contributing factor. My stability becomes questionable. Each piece, small enough on its own, had been arranged deliberately. That was the moment I realized I wasn't crazy, I was inconvenient. The words formed in my mind before I spoke them aloud. Ms. Alvarez didn't respond immediately. She simply continued flipping pages. "There's also a discrepancy here," she said. "Your academic records were never requested during the initial evaluation, nor were independent character references. I almost laughed, but it came out hollow. No one had asked my professors whether I had been unstable. No one had contacted the advocacy group I interned with. The only voices shaping my diagnosis had been inside my house. Inside my house. For 2 years I had questioned my memory in quiet moments. Wondered if perhaps I had missed something in myself. If maybe my intensity had crossed a line I hadn't recognized. But the paper trail didn't show instability. It showed strategy. Ms. Alvarez closed the folder gently. "We're going to present this at your review hearing," she said. I felt something shift inside me, not relief, not yet. Alignment. For the first time since that blue pen touched paper, the documented version of events began to resemble the truth I remembered. I wasn't unstable. I was inconvenient to a story that needed a different villain. And stories unravel when evidence interrupts them. I had waited 2 years for someone to read carefully. Now someone had. I didn't cry when Ms. Alvarez closed the file. I didn't demand immediate release or call my mother in outrage. For 2 years I had imagined the moment someone finally believed me. I thought it would feel explosive. Instead it felt precise. Controlled. "Documentation matters," Ms. Alvarez said. "But presentation matters too." So I began preparing the way I once prepared for exams. We requested my academic transcripts. Letters from professors who remembered my consistency. Email timestamps proving I had been at home studying the night of the accident. Phone records confirming when my mother received the call. Each piece wasn't dramatic on its own. But together they built something stronger than emotion. I also met discreetly with a legal aid attorney assigned to cases involving involuntary commitment appeals. He was quiet, deliberate. "You don't need to attack your family," he advised. "You just need to establish inconsistency." Inconsistency. It was the word I had been circling for months. I reviewed my own intake statements carefully. Every sentence I had spoken in frustration, every attempt to defend myself had been filtered through diagnostic language. This time I chose restraint. No long explanations. No emotional appeals. Just facts. I remember thinking how different this felt from the beginning. Back then I had tried to convince people with urgency. I had believed that if I spoke clearly enough, loudly enough, someone would recognize the truth. Now I understood that calm travels further. In the weeks before the review hearing I practiced answering questions without overextending. Yes. No. That is incorrect. Here is the documentation. The desperation that had once hovered beneath my words was gone. In its place was structure. Ms. Alvarez warned me gently. "Your mother may testify again." I nodded. For years her voice had carried more weight than mine. That reality didn't change overnight. But this time her narrative would meet paper. And paper does not bend to emotion. On the night before the hearing I lay awake, not with anxiety but with clarity. 2 years had stripped away my need for immediate validation. What I wanted now wasn't revenge. It was record correction. I wasn't preparing to confront my family. I was preparing to outlast their version of events. The review hearing was held in a room that looked more administrative than judicial. Fluorescent lights. A long table. 3 panel members seated across from me with folders stacked neatly in front of them. My mother sat to the side, hands folded tightly in her lap. Daniel occupied the chair beside her, staring at a fixed point somewhere just above the floor. I hadn't seen them in person in nearly 2 years. When my name was called I stood calmly and took my seat. The chairperson began with procedure. Dates. Prior recommendations. Behavioral summaries. Then my mother was invited to speak. She rose slowly, voice steady but heavy with practiced concern. "We were frightened," she said. She wasn't herself. She was overwhelmed. I did what I believed was necessary to protect everyone. Protect everyone. She described me as rigid, obsessive, emotionally volatile under stress. She avoided specifics, leaning instead on impressions. It escalated quickly, she added. We didn't know what she might do. Daniel remained silent. When asked whether he wished to provide additional context, he shook his head without lifting his gaze. The panel members listened carefully, making small notes. I felt the familiar weight of narrative attempting to settle over the room. Concerned mother. Troubled daughter. Family acting in crisis. Social stakes were high. Their reputation stable, respectable, protectivist on maintaining that version of events. Then the chairperson turned to me. Do you wish to respond? The room seemed to narrow. This was the moment they expected: desperation. Emotion. A plea for release framed in frustration. Instead, I placed my hands flat on the table and said calmly, "Yes." And the paper trail waited between us. "Yes," I said and slid the first document forward. I began with the police report. On the night of the accident, I explained, keeping my tone even. The initial statement given by my brother indicates he was alone in the vehicle. One of the panel members leaned closer to the page. His statement was amended after a private conversation with a family member, I continued. There is no documentation placing me at the scene prior to that revision. My mother shifted in her chair. I moved to the phone records. These timestamps confirm I was at home when the accident occurred. The call from my mother came at 11:47 p.m. after the police had already arrived. A panel member glanced toward Daniel. "Is that accurate?" he asked. Daniel cleared his throat but did not answer directly. "It was chaotic," he said finally. I nodded once. "I agree. It was chaotic." Next came my academic transcripts and internship confirmation letters. "There is no prior record of behavioral incidents," I said. "No disciplinary reports. No documented instability." I let the words settle before adding, "The recommendation for extended commitment relied primarily on collateral family testimony." Collateral family testimony? The chairperson flipped through the intake summary again, this time more slowly. "Ms. Foster," he said to my mother, "can you provide independent documentation supporting your concerns at the time?" She hesitated. "We were acting out of fear," she replied. "We didn't think to gather paperwork." "Fear of what?" another panelist asked. Silence followed. My mother's voice softened. She was intense. She challenged us. Challenged. I kept my expression neutral. "Intensity during exam season is not a psychiatric diagnosis," I said carefully. "Nor is disagreement." A faint murmur passed between the panel members. I placed the final document on the table, a timeline Ms. Alvarez and I had compiled aligning statements, revisions, and recommendations. "You'll notice," I said, "that the narrative shifted only after my brother's legal exposure became evident. His blood alcohol level was high. His liability was clear. The introduction of my alleged instability coincided with that shift." The room felt different now, not accusatory but analytical. Daniel finally looked at me. Not with anger. Not with remorse. With recognition. He knew. He knew the sequence. He also knew that silence was safer than contradiction. The chairperson folded his hands. "Miss Foster," he said to my mother again, "did you inform clinicians that your son's statement had changed?" She blinked. "We were trying to protect the family." Protect. There it was, stripped of polish. And in doing so, the panelist replied evenly, "Your daughter was committed based on incomplete information." The air seemed to thin. I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward. "I am not asking for sympathy," I said quietly. "I am asking for accuracy." For 2 years I had been contained by a story. Now the story was being read aloud, line by line. The panel excused us briefly to deliberate. When they returned, the decision was measured and procedural. Based on the inconsistencies identified, and the absence of documented clinical indicators supporting continued commitment, we are authorizing immediate release. Immediate. The word felt solid. My mother's composure fractured just slightly. Daniel exhaled sharply. No applause followed. No dramatic confrontation. Just the steady dismantling of a narrative that could not withstand scrutiny. For the first time since that blue pen touched paper, the record matched reality. And reality, when documented carefully, is difficult to silence. When the formalities were finished and the paperwork stamped, my mother approached me in the hallway. "We can take you home," she said, as if the last 2 years had been an extended misunderstanding. "Home." I looked at her carefully, not with anger but with clarity. "I won't be coming back," I said. Her expression tightened. "You don't mean that." "I do." Daniel stood a few steps behind her, silent. "I understand you believed you were protecting him," I continued. "But protection doesn't require erasing someone else." My mother's voice trembled slightly. "We were trying to hold the family together." "Loyalty doesn't mean self-sacrifice," I replied. "It doesn't mean absorbing consequences that aren't yours." For years I had mistaken endurance for devotion. I won't be the convenient solution anymore, I said quietly. If you want a relationship with me, it will have to be based on truth. There was no anger in my tone, just finality. Then I walked toward the exit, not back to the house where the narrative began, but forward into something that belonged to me. Release didn't come with fanfare. There was no press, no public statement, no dramatic apology. Just paperwork processed, signatures verified, and a quiet escort to the front doors I had not walked through in 2 years. But paper trails leave marks. Within weeks, my attorney filed a formal complaint regarding the amended police statement and the incomplete disclosure during my initial commitment hearing. It did not lead to arrests. It did not need to. It triggered internal reviews. Daniel's driving record was re-examined. The earlier leniency he had received suddenly looked different when viewed alongside revised statements. His employer, who had once described him as high potential, placed him on administrative leave pending clarification. Nothing explosive happened, just friction. People who had once nodded sympathetically at my mother began asking quieter, more careful questions. Why had there been no independent evaluation? Why had timelines shifted? Reputation doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes when certainty is replaced with doubt. Daniel called me once 3 weeks after my release. You didn't have to push it that far, he said. I didn't push anything, I replied. I corrected it. He was silent for a long moment. I didn't think it would go that way, he admitted finally. Neither had I. My mother reached out more often than he did. At first her messages were tentative. How are you adjusting? Do you need anything? I answered politely but briefly. Then one afternoon she asked to meet for coffee. She looked smaller than I remembered, not physically but in posture. The certainty that had carried her through that hospital office was gone. I thought I was protecting him, she said again, but this time there was less conviction behind it. I know, I replied. And I thought you were strong enough to handle it. There it was. The logic that had shaped everything. I was, I said. But strength doesn't make it fair. She nodded, tears forming but not falling. I don't know how to fix this, she admitted. You can't fix the past, I said calmly. You can only stop repeating it. We did not hug. We did not resolve everything in that cafe. But something shifted. In the months that followed, the community adjusted quietly. People who had once treated me with cautious distance began speaking more directly. Former professors reached out after hearing partial accounts of what had happened. One even offered to help me reapply to law programs if I chose to. Daniel moved out of town shortly after his leave became permanent. Whether from embarrassment or opportunity, one don't know. My mother and I speak occasionally now. Carefully. Without assumptions. No one calls me unstable anymore. No one suggests I imagined it. The consequences weren't loud. They were structural. And sometimes that is enough. For a long time I believed freedom would feel like walking out of a locked building. Sunlight. Fresh air. Movement without supervision. But that wasn't the part that changed me. The real confinement had been narrative control, being described in ways that didn't match my memory, my history, or my character. Being reduced to a version of myself that was convenient for someone else's protection. When I stepped through those doors, what I carried with me wasn't anger. It was accuracy. I had been the scapegoat because I was stable enough to hold the weight. Because I was logical enough to make the story plausible. Because I was strong enough to survive it. For years I thought that strength had made me vulnerable. Now I understand it made me dangerous to any version of events that couldn't withstand documentation. Freedom isn't just the absence of walls. It's the refusal to live inside someone else's explanation. They locked a door to protect their son. What they didn't realize was that I was building something far stronger on the other side. And when I walked free, I took the story with me.